Go right ahead.
Good to see Rabbi Green, Marty, and Ron. So as we do every week, we're going to be studying the background of a halacha, sugya, a topic in halacha that relates to the Parshat, to the Seder of this week. The topic in halacha that we're going to be focusing on today is netilas yadayim shachris, the chiyuv, the obligation, the halacha that we wash our hands in the morning. This idea of washing our hands in the morning has a very direct relationship with this week's parsha, as we will see later, but we'll save that for soon. We'll save that for later on because it'll come into the shir. Today's shir is based on Likutei Sichos Chelik Lamed Aleph, volume 31. Let's start with the Rambam. The Rambam, in the laws of davening, in the laws of tefillah, says as follows. He brings 5 things that a person must do before they daven. And he says, Chamisha dvar ma'akvim es hatefillah. There are 5 things that prevent a person from davening. Afa pi she'egiya zman. In other words, not including the fact that it has to be in the right time of davening. Shachris has to be in its time, Mincha in its time, Ma'ariv in its time. But in addition to that, there are 5 things that a person has to do to prepare themselves for davening. The first one that the Rambam mentions is taras yadayim. We have to have clean hands. He actually doesn't say clean hands. He says purification of one's hands. It has to be tahar. We do that by washing our hands. The Rambam then continues to say, when is it that you only have to wash your hands for davening? That's in all other davenings besides for the morning davening of Shachris. Avol Shachris, but the morning davening, the morning prayer, Roichet, you have to wash, you have to rinse, not just your hands. Panav, your face, Yadav, your hands, Viraglav, and your feet. V'achar kach yispal, and then you could daven. Doesn't sound like something of our time, but that's the halacha in the Rambam. We'll see soon how Shulchan Aruch quotes it. But the Rambam says for Shachris, a person has to wash their face, their hands, as well as their feet. Now, this wasn't only an interesting thing to say to wash your feet before davening. It's not only an interesting thing to say today, it was in fact an interesting thing to say in the times of the Rambam. As we find that the Ravid who argues many times in the Rambam, on the side of the Rambam, so he writes, Lo yadaiti raglav lama. I don't know why the Rambam included feet. They have to wash your feet. Washing your hands, I understand, but why do you have to wash your feet? Now, the way it works like this, let me just give a little bit of a background. When it comes to the Rambam, so you have the Ravid, usually is always on the attack. Very often, he's always attacking the Rambam in many different things. I don't know where he got this from. I don't know where he got that from. In the beginning of the Rambam, he's very, very harsh. It sounds like throughout the Rambam, he gains a lot of respect for the Rambam. But in the beginning, he really, really uses harsh terms. So when it comes to Hilchos Tefillah with these halachas, so he says, I don't know why the Rambam adds the feet. Now, I was in the middle of saying how it works is that there are other mefarshim, what we call them noisei kliya Rambam. Noisei kliya literally means those who carry the bags for the Rambam. Carrying the bags means that they defend the Rambam. So every time the Rambam is being attacked by the Ravid, so you have a bunch of other commentators that are going to come and defend him. One of the main defenders of the Rambam on the page is the Migdal Oz. The Migdal Oz sometimes goes to great length, sometimes even what seems to be strange, just to defend the Rambam. So what is he going to say? The Ravid says he doesn't know why the Rambam adds feet. Comes the Migdal Oz and says, I don't know what you're talking about. It's very simple why he adds feet. He says like this, I'll read the Hebrew and then I'll translate. He says, V'ani talmidai, me being the student of the Rambam, I found it clearly stated in a brisa passage that's brought in the Gemara. It says clearly, B'shmaita b'sraisa the Parah b'metaimnim, in the last sugya, basically the last discussion in the Parah, in the chapter of b'metaimnim, which is in the laws of Shabbos, in the tractate of Shabbos, the Asiknam Savri La Kihad Tanya. And he quotes over there a brisa, and I'm going to go straight to the brisa in the Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Tanya says in a brisa, "Reichetz Adam Panav Yad V'Ragla B'Chol Yaim B'Shvil Kainai." A person must rinse their face, must wash their face, their hands, and their feet every single day. Yeshvil koine for Hashem. I want to say take a shower every single day. Mishum shenemar, because the pasuk says in Mishlei, poel Hashem l'maneu. Hashem made everything for His own purpose. In other words, everything could be used to serve Hashem. So our face has to be washed to serve Hashem. Our hands have to be washed to serve Hashem, and our feet have to be washed to serve Hashem. So the Migdal Oz says, wait a second, what do you mean you don't know why the Rambam wrote feet? It says clearly in the Gemara, you have to wash your feet. So now that the table's turned, right? Now the question is going to come on the Ravid. How did you miss this? How did you miss this clear Gemara that says you have to wash not only your hands, but also your feet? About the face, washing the face, let's get to that later. But right now we're focusing on the feet and hands. So the Kesef Mishnah, who's another commentator on the Rambam, he says, to defend the Ravid, he says, V'li nira d'lo yishtamte hai brayso laharavid. It's not that the Ravid missed this Gemara. It's not that he missed the Gemara that says clearly you have to wash your hands and feet. Rather, the Ravid learned that the Gemara and said that has nothing to do with davening. The idea of taking a shower, washing your feet and washing your face has nothing to do with davening. What the Gemara is describing there, what the Gemara is discussing there, is a halachic defense to be allowed to wash yourself. In other words, a person might say, hey, am I allowed to beautify myself? Right? We know there's the Torah says, "Leisilbash gever simos isha," about a man behaving like a woman, things like that. So some might say, "Oh, I'm not allowed to, rinse myself." So the Gemara says, "No, there's a brisa that you're allowed to wash your hands, face, and feet. In other words, you're allowed to wash yourself off, but not that it has anything to do with preparing for davening." You hear? The reason why the Ravid read the Rambam and said, "Wash your feet for davening," where does he get this from? Because the brisa that says about washing feet is not in relation to davening. It's in relation to defending the practice of washing ourselves off, of rinsing our bodies. That's what he says. Let me read the Kesef Mishnah. He says, it was not taught in the context of davening, high brisa, that teaching. But rather in the matter of im mutter lichratz padna v'raglav kedei liafas asmin kapir Rashi. As Rashi says there in the Gemara, that the discussion about rinsing your feet, your face, your hands, that's in the context of being allowed to wash yourself. Nothing to do with preparing for davening. Okay, now the tables turned. So we went back and forth. By the way, if I'm making you confused, I'm sorry. I want to keep track here. We started off with a Rambam that says wash your face, wash your hands, and wash your feet before davening. The Ravid asked, I don't understand why feet. The Migdaloi's answer, defending the Rambam, says, what do you mean? It says clearly in a brayso, you have to wash your feet. The Kesef Mishnah defended the Ravid and said, yeah, but that's not talking about davening. So now the ball is back in the court of the Rambam. Explain to me, how did you see from this teaching that it has anything to do with davening? So one of the Mefarshim bring a more sort of, not contemporary, but more contemporary, the Parah. He says that he found that there is another version of that brisa, of that Gemara. The Gemara that says you have to wash your hands, face, and feet, there's another version, and it's slightly different, but it's a major difference. Slightly different, but a fundamental one. What is that? Over there, it doesn't just say you have to, how do we know that a person should wash their hands, face, and feet every single day for Hashem, because everything Hashem created could be used for to serve Hashem? There's another line there. It says, Mishum shenemar, because the pasuk says, this is the key line. Hikoin likrasa l'kecha Yisrael. Prepare before you approach Hashem. Prepare before you meet. Prepare yourself to meet your God, O Israel. In other words, according to this reading, it is clearly talking about preparing for davening. So that's in other words, what we ended up with is that if you open up a Gemara the way it is in our Gemaras, it's not an explanation for the Rambam. It's not a defense for the Rambam. There's sort of no source in where we learn they have to wash your feet before davening. But if we look at this other version of the Gemara that has one additional line that says that the reason why you have to wash your feet is to prepare yourself to meet Hashem, then it is talking about the context of davening specifically. That is the defense. That is the not only defense, that's a source for the Rambam. Okay. Beautiful. I think we ended up with two camps. Yes, feet or no feet. Yes, wash feet or no wash feet. The Rambam says yes, the Rabbi says no. But we are left a little bit wondering, why doesn't the Rambam bring this pasuk to explain himself? And also, if it's about preparing for davening, why is it only Shachris? If it's right, if it's preparing for davening, in general, preparing for davening, then also mincha you should have to. So Mariv you should have to. This pasuk, prepare yourself to meet your God, by the way, is brought in Shulchan Aruch, that a person should make sure their clothing is clean before davening. And that's not only chakras, any davening. So if the Rambam sees this as the source, then it shouldn't be exclusively for chakras. It should apply also for mincha and for Ma'ariv. So for this, we're going to move on to another explanation of why the Rambam includes feet. This one comes from a tshuva, Shaios Tshuvas, responses, known as Vishav HaKoyin, written by a great Rabbi Fall of Hamburg in Germany, and he explains the Rambam as follows. And here's where we're going to get to this week's Parsha, because this is where we're going to get to this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha, in the beginning of the Parsha, we learn that the Kohen, every single day, the Kohanim, when they started their Avodah, they started their service in the Mishkan, they wash their hands and feet. There's a mitzvah for them to wash their hands and feet every single day. So the Vishav HaKoyin, again, this Rabbi Fall of Hamburg, he quotes a Rashba. Okay, now let's try to, I want to make sure I'm being clear here. This is not the Rambam. This is another, the Rashbas of the sort of, also a Rishon, just like the Rambam. And he writes like this. Let me read his words in Hebrew, and again, I'll translate them. Because every morning we are like a new being, a brand new being, a new creation. Therefore, we must thank Hashem every morning for the opportunity, the ability, and for the honor of being able to serve Hashem. While Davar Zed is for this reason, since we are new every single day, meaning that we're starting to serve Hashem fresh every single day. Therefore, every morning we come to Shul. I know the Ashkenaz minhag is that they say this in Shul, but the Chabad minhag, we say it at home, is that we say all the brachas in the morning. Right? All the brachas that we say, and all the other brachas are all about recognizing and thanking Hashem for giving us the opportunity to be His servant. And then he concludes, the Rashba says like this. I'll put the pointer. It is for this reason, because every morning we're starting to serve Hashem brand new and fresh. Therefore, we have to sanctify ourselves with sanctity, with Hashem's sanctity, Hashem's holiness. We have to wash our hands, just like a kohen, shemakadesh yadav, that washes his hands minakir, from the kir, the basin, before he starts his work. He only mentions hands, right? Comes the Vishav HaKoyin, this Rabbi Fall of Hamburg, and he says, he basically applies this idea that us washing our hands in the morning is akin, and it's really mirroring and similar to the Kohen beginning his work. And he says, look, just by the Kohen, it wasn't just hand, it was also feet. That's how the Rambam learns that we have to wash not only our hands, but also our feet. Let me read his words. That was the Rashba. Comes the Vishav HaKoyin, says, since every morning the Kohen had to wash his hands and his feet, that's why we have to wash our hands and our feet every morning in the beginning of the day. And you might want to ask, like we asked before, why only Shachris? He says, just like a kohen only has to rinse his hands and feet once a day in the beginning of the day, for that reason, therefore we don't have to wash our hands and feet for the rest of the day. We have to wash our hands before mincha, but that's only because our hands are very busy and they touch things that are unclean. But essentially, we start our day every day like a kohen. We wash our hands and we wash our feet. Just like a kohen washed his hands, washed his feet at the beginning of his day of Avodah. So this Rabbi Fall of Hamburg, he says, you want to know the source of the Rambam? It's clearly in this week's Parsha. We wash our hands and feet like a kohen who washed his hands and feet. And he says, don't take it from me, take it from the Rashba who learns the idea of washing in the first place from the kohen. So this is another defense of the Rambam. Okay, so really what we're holding now, we have no questions. The Rambam is clear. The Rambam is very clear. He says, you wash your hands and feet. Why do you wash your hands and feet? Because the kohen washed his hands and feet every day in the morning. Let's, figuratively speaking, take the Rambam and put it a little bit aside on a shelf. We're going to need it soon. But now we're going to move our attention to Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch doesn't have it as that length as what we're about to quote, because what we're about to quote is the Shulchan Aruch Harav. The Baal HaTanya has a Shulchan Aruch, and in his Shulchan Aruch he writes much more detail than the general Shulchan Aruch, and he writes as follows. And listen to his words. I'm going to try to, I should really let's read the English. I'm going to read the Hebrew, read the English. When one gets up in the morning, whether he relieves himself or not, he must wash his hands with at least a quarter of a lug of water from a container. A revius, it's depends depends who you're going to ask. Something 4 or 5 ounces, not a lot of. That's the amount that would cover your hand. This idea of washing applies even if he does not desire to pray until several hours later. He wakes up in the morning and he goes to a shiur and he's eating breakfast, whatever it is. He's only going to go daven in a few hours. He still has to start his day with washing. Because the Holy One, blessed be He, restores one's soul. He becomes like a newly created being. As in the verse, they are new every morning. When retiring at night, a person entrusts his weary soul to the Holy One, blessed be He, who returns it to him when he rises in the morning renewed and rested, so that he can exert himself on behalf of Hashem with all his potential and serve Him throughout the day. For this is the entire purpose of man. We should therefore sanctify ourselves in His holiness by washing our hands from a container to prepare to carry out His service and minister to Him. Like a kohen who would sanctify his hands from the basin in the Beis HaMikdash every day before beginning his service. Now, in this quote in Shulchan Aruch Harav, we see something very interesting. He doesn't use this idea of washing hands as a preparation for davening. He actually explicitly says it's not a preparation for davening. What is it a preparation for? It's a preparation for the whole day. In other words, it's washing the hands the first thing in the morning, not about before davening. Even if you plan on davening in a few hours, you have to wash your hands right away. And to point this out a little bit more, remember the Rambam that we're speaking of is in the laws of davening, because he sees washing as a preparation for davening. Here in Shulchan Aruch Harav, it's Hilchos Netilas Yadayim. It's the washing of the morning. It's not even talking about a preparation for davening. It's the preparation for the day. So this is a different, really, approach to washing hands. There's the approach of the Rambam, and there's the approach of the Shulchan Aruch Harav. But before we get to that, let's go a little bit deeper into the washing, and let me explain where we're holding in our explanation here. We have the Rambam.
Just turn it down.
We have the Rambam, and we have the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Both of them learn that what's the source of washing every day? The source of washing every day is from the kohen in this week's Parsha. But they're learning it in different ways. The Rambam is learning it as a preparation for davening, whereas Shulchan Aruch Harav is learning it as a preparation for the day. So how is it that you have two people, the Rambam, Shulchan Aruch Harav, learning from the same source, from the kohen every day in the Beis HaMikdash, and they're learning it differently? This one taking it as a preparation for davening, the Rambam, and the Shulchan Aruch Harav taking it as a preparation for the day. For that, we have to realize as follows: that in the washing of the hands and feet of the kohen in the Beis HaMikdash, there were two elements, meaning every morning the kohen would come, wash his hands and feet, and two things were accomplished by him washing his hands and feet. What were the two things? I want to use two Hebrew terms: tahara and kedusha. Tahara means purification. Purification means that if it was impure, you want to be pure. Pure, when a person is pure, means that they are now prepared for what? For holiness. And then there is holiness. That's Kedusha. Like the Ramban, it says Rambam here, but the Ramban in this week's Parsha says that the reason why the Kohen would have to wash his hands every day is to make sure his hands and feet are clean. It's very simple. Our hands and feet are busy. They touch things that are not clean, not pure, contaminated, and so on. So before we start the Avodah, before the Kohen starts the Avodah, he has to wash his hands to sort of transition from the previous to now what he's about to do. I hadn't thought about this before, but I actually think this is a good example. The right translation for Tara might be to sanitize. It's to sanitize our hands. Doesn't make the hands better, it just makes them pure from anything that might be on them. Right? We've all been sanitizing our hands for a year now, Baruch Hashem. And I say Baruch Hashem for sure. Everything is Baruch Hashem. But after Tara, then there's Kedusha. Kedusha, see, I'm missing S here, but the Kedusha is a holiness. Like the Targum Onkelos in this week's Parsha, when he says, V'rachatzun Aaron uvanav es yadayim es ragleim, that Aaron and his children would wash their hands and feet. How does he translate wash? He doesn't say wash, it's to sanitize, to v'rachatzu, to clean. He says v'kadshun, to sanctify their hands. Sanctify is different than to purify. Sanctify means that with this water, I'm making the hands holy. Not just I'm making them pure so they're prepared for holiness. I'm making them holy. Whereas the Gemara, in many places, when it's speaking about the Kohen washing his hands and feet, what's the term that it uses? Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, the sanctification of the hands and the feet. Now, what's the difference? Let's think about it. What's the difference between the idea of tahara, of sanitizing the hands, versus the idea of sanctifying the hands? There'll be multiple differences, and we're going to see how this plays out in everything we're learning today. But first and foremost, when you speak about sanitizing, then there's no difference between the hands and the feet. Why not? Because just like in a mikveh, it's the whole body. You have to completely transition from the past to the coming, to what you're about to do. But when it comes to sanctification, it is obvious that the hands that are more actively involved in doing the holy work would become holy. So if you see, I know I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so I'm gonna say this, but I'm gonna explain it in a few minutes. Let me just say the crux of it. If we see the washing of the hands as a matter of tahara, of sanitizing, as a matter of purifying, tahara, then the hands and feet are in the same category. But if you see the washing of the hands as kedusha, as holiness, then yes, the kohen in the Beis Hamikdash would wash his hands and feet, but it's not the same. The sanctification of the hands was obviously on a greater level, because the hands were actively involved in doing the service of Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash. And I want to point out that in this week's parsha, you see this clearly in the Pesukim. What I'm about to highlight is actually something that the great Rogatchover Goin, Yosef Razin, he points the following thing out. Fascinating. He says there's a pasuk that's repeated twice in this week's parsha. In the beginning of the parsha, when it speaks about the mitzvah of the kohen washing his hands and feet every day, it says it twice, right after each other. Let me read it. You'll see. It says, "V'rachatzu Aaron avanim mimenu es yedayim v'sargleim. V'rachatzu yedayim v'ragleim v'lo yimusu." Aaron and his children will wash their hands and feet, and the next pasuk is, and they'll wash their hands and feet. It says it twice. But the Rogatchover Goin points out that the first pasuk is written differently. In the first pasuk it says, Es Yadayim ve'es Raglayim. It puts hands and feet in two separate categories. And in the second pasuk it groups them together. Yadayim ve'raglayim, the hands and the feet. What's the difference? If you're focusing on the element of tahara, of sanitizing, of purification, Yadayim ve'raglayim, hands and feet are grouped together. That's the second pasuk. The first pasuk, es yedayim, the es raglayim, because the hands are in one category, the feet are in another category, because we're talking about sanctification, we're talking about kedusha, holiness. The holiness that the feet are involved in is not the same holiness that the hands are involved in. The hands of the kohen are more involved actively in a greater matter of holiness. Now that we see this, what did we just see? We just saw that the kohen, when he would come every morning and wash his hands and feet, he was accomplishing two things, tahara and kedusha. The Rambam, who says they have to wash your hands and feet, he's coming, he's saying that what are we doing every day when we wash in the morning? We're accomplishing tahara. What are we trying to mimic from the kohen in the Beis Hamikdash? We're trying to mimic the tahara, the sanitizing and the purification. By the way, I'm not just making this up in the Rambam. Let's look. In the words that the Rambam uses, you can't see in any other way. He says, the Rambam specifically uses the words taharas yadayim, the purification of the hands. That's how he refers to it. So that's why the hands and feet in the Rambam's perspective are grouped together. Because, like I said, when it comes to purification, hands and feet are the same. But when it comes to kedusha, when it comes to the holiness that the kohen accomplished, hands and feet are not the same. And therefore, when we wash our hands today, what are we trying to get from the kohen? The idea of kedusha, the idea of holiness. And when it comes to holiness, the hands are the ones that are most actively involved. To use the words of the Rashba, listen to this. And it's also the words that the Alter Rebbe used in Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch Rabbi says, "Tzrichim lehiskadesh b'kedushasei." It doesn't say that we have to be mitaher, we have to purify ourselves. It says that we have to be mekadesh, to sanctify ourselves. That's why the only thing that's in focus is the hands, not the feet. Now, this difference of why the Rambam sees it one way and the Shulchan Aruch Harav sees it another way. Remember, let me just rephrase that. The Rambam looks at the washing of the kohen and says, what are we trying to copy from him? We're trying to copy the tahara, the purification, therefore you have hands and feet. The Shulchan Aruch Harav says, what are we trying to copy from the kohen? Is it kedusha, the sanctification? Therefore, what are we trying to copy is only the hands. That's because it's a different perspective of why we wash our hands every day. The Rambam's reason why we wash our hands every day is because we're about to go pray, we're about to go daven. And davening is the equivalent of the korbanos, right? The Gemara says, Tefillah is b'makom korbanos tiknum. We daven shachris mincha ma'ariv at the same times, and this equivalency, to the korbanos that were brought every day, the korban tamid. So when you're going to daven, you're going to be like a kohen. And since you're going to be like a kohen, you have to wash your hands like a kohen. But the Shulchan Aruch Harav, he's saying, no. We don't wash our hands because we're going to daven per se. We wash our hands for the whole idea of serving Hashem. We wash it right in the morning, even if you're not ready to daven, even if you're going to daven in many hours. Why do you wash your hands in the morning? Because to sanctify yourself to the service of Hashem. It's not about the purification from what you were doing before to what you're about to do. It's about a complete really elevation, I should use. I think that's a good term. Elevation to put yourself into the mode and into the status of serving Hashem. It's not tahara, it's not about purification, it's about kedusha, it's about sanctification. That's why it's not about preparing for davening, but rather about an entry into a state of service of Hashem that we do every morning. So this is the halachic difference between washing just our hands or washing also our feet. We're not done. As we do every week, we have to take this halacha and realize how this halacha is talking much deeper than just about washing hands. This halacha is talking about something about us and talking about teaching us about ourselves a lot and about our neshama. So for this, we have to go into the nefesh halacha, to the neshama of this halacha. To do that, we have to go back to something that we sort of glossed over and we skipped over. And what is that? What about the face? We spoke about washing hands. We spoke about washing feet. We forgot about washing the face. The Rambam says you wash the face. The Shulchan Aruch says you don't wash the face. You don't have to wash your face. And we now know that the Rambam is coming from the perspective of Tahara, and the Shulchan Aruch is coming from the perspective of Kedusha, of sanctification and holiness. Why does that have any role with washing the face versus not washing the face? By the way, I want to be clear. You're allowed to wash your face. The question is if you have to. That's the maskana. That's the machlokes here. It's not about if you're allowed to. It's about if you have to. What's the difference between our face and our hands and our feet? You know, I want to start with the face. The word in Hebrew, for face is panav. Panim. Panim is also the meaning of pnimius. Pnim means internal, right? You know, very simply spoken, if you want to know if someone's happy, you can't see, in other words, how a person is feeling inside, if they're happy, sad, or whatever. You can look in their arms or their hands or their feet to figure that out. You're going to have to look at their face. Their face is sort of the window to their inner feelings and emotions and to what they're thinking. So, panim, the face, represents the pnimius, the inner part of a Jew. The hands and feet, on the other hand, represents the chitzonius, the exterior of a Jew. The exterior of a Jew is constantly involved in material things, mundane things, worldly things, physical things. As the pasuk says in Tehillim, "Yagia kapecha kiseichel ashrecha v'tevlech." If you eat the toil of your hands, you are praiseworthy. Chassidus explains that to mean, if you eat the toil of your hands, in other words, if physical things, the only thing that gets that you get the toil that involves toil is your hands. Your mind, your heart are reserved for holy things. The toil is our hands and feet, but our mind and heart, if we put our mind and heart into the work, then it's not praiseworthy. Our mind and heart have to be reserved for holier things. There's a beautiful story of the fourth Chabad Rebbe, known as the Rebbe Maharash, Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitch, Shmuel Schneerson of Lubavitch, that he had a chassid, a student that came to him. Now, this was during the time when they just invented the galoshes, right? The rubbers, boots to put on your feet to protect from the snow. It was a very in thing. It was like a great invention, right? Because you could protect your feet. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys from up north. You know, we all know galoshes are very useful things. So in Russia, it was very, very useful. So it was an in thing then. And this student, this chassid, came to the Rebbe, and he came in to see the Rebbe, and he's speaking to the Rebbe about his business, and he wants to know. He wants a bracha for this business, a bracha for that business deal. He's asking advice. What should he do about this? He came into his Rebbe. He's not asking about serving Hashem. He's not asking about nachas from his children, about shalom bayis with his wife, about his davening, about his learning. The only thing that he's asking about is business. So he finishes asking the Rebbe for all of his blessings, and the Rebbe looks at him and says, "You know, I've seen many times people put their feet in galoshes. This is the first time I see someone put their head in the galoshin." Ron, you're wondering what's the head in the galoshin? He put his head in the boots. Your head is involved in the boots. I actually, to add a little beauty to the story, I think his business was he was a galoshin dealer. The point is that was his business. The point is his mind was in it. Why is his head in the boots? Why is his head in the shmutz? Our hands and feet could be in shmutz. Our head, our pnimius, our inner faculties of our mind and our heart should never be contaminated and schmutz and soiled with mundane physical things. So The Rambam says, the Kohen, when he started every day his service in the Beis Hamikdash, he would wash his hands and feet, and not his face. But the Rambam says nowadays you got to wash your face. In the times of the Beis Hamikdash, a Jew's pnimius, a Jew's inner faculties were reserved for holiness. They were not contaminated. They were not soiled. So you didn't have to wash your face. You didn't have to wash your, face being the representative of the pnimius. You didn't have to wash your pnimius, rinse your pnimius. Your pnimius, your inner devotion was always attached to holy things. You didn't have to rinse that. You didn't have to be metaharit. You didn't have to sanitize your pnimius. But nowadays, in the times of Galus, says the Rambam, unfortunately, our minds and hearts are not as pure. And our minds and hearts have to be rinsed. We have to rinse our minds and hearts, also our pnimius, our face. That's what the Rambam says, and that's why, even though we learn from the Kohen the idea of washing, the Rambam says, in addition to hands and feet, we also have to include the face. Because nowadays, you got to wash your pnimius too. Comes the Shulchan Aruch Harav and says that might be true about tahara, that might be true about sanitizing and purifying, but in terms of kedusha, of holiness, we must know and always remember that the pnimius of a Jew, the panim, the face, in other words, the inner faculties of a Jew, the neshama, will never be tampered with and will never be soiled. Even in the time of Galus, it doesn't need holiness. You know why? Because it remains in its holiest of states. It remains one with Hashem. So when it comes to kedusha, to holiness, the pnimius, the face, right? Pnimius being face. The pnimius of a Jew, the inner faculties of a Jew, the neshama of a Jew is always whole and always holy. Again, when it comes to tahara, to purification, okay, yes, it's true. Our faculties, our inner faculties might not be as pure as it was in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. But when it comes to kedusha, to holiness, the pnimius of a Jew is always holy. And being that we're washing in the morning for the purpose of holiness, you don't have to wash your face. Your face is always holy. One of the reasons why we wake up in the morning, we say Moida Ani Lefanecha, and we say it without Hashem's name. We say it even before we wash our hands. So the simple reason is that we don't mention Hashem's name because our hands are not clean yet. But in Chassidus, I want to add something beautiful here. The reason why we wake up in the morning and say Moida Ani before we wash our hands is to teach us something very, very important about ourselves. That no matter how impure we are, our Moida'ani, meaning our attachment to Hashem, our connection to Hashem, could never, ever be defiled. It can never become impure. It can never be contaminated. We do it before washing our hands to teach us and for us to recognize that this part of me, the neshama that's in me, nothing, absolutely nothing could contaminate it. And therefore, there's no need to be mekadesh, to sanctify the panim, the pnimius of a Jew. It's always holy. It's always holy. You have to rinse it, maybe to clean it off from shmutz that attach to it. That's what the Rambam is talking about. But the Shulchan Aruch Harav says you never have to be mekadesh it. Washing in the morning is a matter of kiddush. It's a matter of sanctity. Therefore, we don't have to. I'm going to mention something just because it might be helpful, but I know I'm bringing something in from left field here. It's that one jug of oil that they found on Hanukkah. That one jug that refuses to be impure, will never be impure. We all have that one jug, that neshama, that nothing could defile it. Nothing could contaminate it. It could be covered, it could be hidden, it could be, soiled in terms of from the outside, but it itself could never become impure. So what did we learn today? We realized that in the halacha of washing hands in the morning, there are two approaches. Both approaches are coming from the perspective that we're learning from the Kohen, who washed his hands every morning, like we learned in this week's Parshat. The question is, what are we learning from the Kohen? Are we learning the idea, the matter of purity or the matter of sanctity? The Rambam says we're learning the matter of purity. And since it's a matter of purity, it's very focused on davening, preparing for davening, and therefore its hands and its feet. And the reason why it's also face is because when it comes to purity nowadays, we also have to purify our face. Shulchan Aruch Harav, on the other hand, says no. What we learned from the Kohen from this week's Parsha is the matter not purity, but sanctity, holiness. We make ourselves holy every morning. It's not about davening. It's about a general holiness to enter the state of serving Hashem every single day. And we have to wash only our hands, not our feet, because when it comes to holiness, it's not the matter of, it's more about what's actively involved in doing the mitzvah. That's what needs the holiness more. That's what not only needs, that's what deserves the holiness more. And the reason why we don't need to wash our face, according to this, is because in matters of holiness, our face is already holy. Our pnimius, the neshama of a Jew is always holy, it always will be holy, and it doesn't need more holiness. It's always complete and always whole in its connection to Hashem. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining together tonight. And look